In the mid-1980s, a catastrophe began inside the CIA, a catastrophe that, at first, no one wanted to call a catastrophe. The people who had been contacted for years, checked, hidden behind cover stories, and protected from Soviet counterintelligence, began disappearing one after another. Communications went dead. Operations that had taken years to build burned down far too quickly. In Moscow, in Washington, in offices where people usually spoke in the dry language of reports, one unpleasant feeling slowly began to appear. Someone could see the internal map of the American network. But the strangest thing was not that the KGB had started finding sources. In the Cold War, things like that happened. The strange part was something else. The failures were too precise, as if the enemy was not guessing, not intercepting, not accidentally picking up a trail, as if someone had simply opened the list in front of them. And this is where the story usually turns into a convenient spy legend. They say the KGB carried out a brilliant operation, the CIA lost a secret duel, and somewhere in the shadows, masters of intelligence were at work. But when you start looking at the facts, the picture becomes far less beautiful and far more disturbing. The first explanations were not searched for inside. That matters. Inside the CIA, they tried to imagine that the problem might be technical, that maybe the communication channels had been compromised, that maybe, somewhere in Moscow, the enemy had gained access to safes, codes, routes, transmission systems. It sounded logical. When a network is collapsing, it is easier to believe that the enemy has found some complex technological hole. It is much harder to admit something else. They had not found a hole. They were letting it through the turnstiles every single day. Because the man who was destroying that network was not sitting somewhere on the other side of the Iron Curtain. He was walking through the corridors of the CIA itself. He received a salary. He passed security checks. He talked to colleagues. He went home. And then he came back to the building that he himself was selling off piece by piece. His name was Aldrich Ames. And what grips me in this story is not only the fact of betrayal itself. There had been traitors in intelligence before him, double agents, defectors, ideological fanatics, people who had been bought, broken, or convinced. But Ames is frightening for a different reason. He did not look like a man capable of causing one of the most destructive failures in the history of American intelligence. He was not a brilliant operative from a movie. He was not a charismatic master of multi-layered combinations. He was not a fanatic who had dreamed since youth of serving Moscow. In documents and recollections about him, an almost humiliating image appears again and again. A mid-level employee, a man with an uneven career, with problems, with fatigue, with the feeling that life was passing him by. And that is exactly why this story matters more than an ordinary story about a spy. If Ames had been a genius, everything would have been simpler. You could say, the system encountered an exception, a unique opponent, a man who could not have been noticed. But the thing is, he was not exceptional. What made him exceptional was his access, and the fact that the system refused, for far too long, to look at simple warning signs. For almost 10 years, a man inside the CIA passed information to the Soviet side, information for which he was paid enormous sums of money. Later, the case files would contain payments, houses, cars, banking traces, strange expenses, dinners, matching dates. All of it would look so obvious that an unpleasant question arises. How could this have continued at all? But in the beginning, no one saw the whole picture. There were only disappearing sources. There were failed operations. There were explanations that sounded technical and convenient. There was fear of admitting that the problem might not be in the codes, not in the Moscow station, not in Soviet surveillance, but right inside their own organization. Intelligence is often built on distrust, on checks, on rules, on access to secrets granted only to those who supposedly deserve trust. But in the Ames case, trust itself became the weak point. The more familiar a person looked inside the system, the harder it became to imagine that he was the source of the catastrophe. And this is where the real question of this case begins. Not simply why one CIA officer sold secrets to the KGB. That question is too easy. Money, resentment, weakness, a new life. We will come to that. The main question is different. Why was an organization that was supposed to catch people like this unable for so long to see its own mole?
The answer does not begin on the day of the arrest, not beside the car, not in court, and not even inside the Soviet embassy. The answer begins earlier, with a man who, for far too long, was considered not dangerous enough to be watched closely. And he really did look, for a long time, not dangerous enough. That is perhaps the most unpleasant part of the entire story, because if you look at Ames's career before the mid-80s, there is almost no image there of a man anyone should have been afraid of. There is no sense of a future catastrophe, no figure of a grand strategist, no legend that practically begs to be turned into a film. Rather, it is the opposite. What we see is a man who always seemed to be near important things, but never became important himself. His father, Carlton Ames, was also connected to the CIA. Before that, he had been a professor of history, and later he ended up inside the intelligence system. But his own career ended badly. Alcoholism, archive work, a feeling of a dead end. And here, a strange family shadow appears. From childhood, Rick lived in a world where intelligence was not some abstract topic from the newspapers, but part of the atmosphere at home. Stories about secret service, about duty, about the state, about lying for a higher purpose. All of this was around him long before he himself received his first security clearance. There is a phrase that sources connect to his father. Lying is wrong, but if the lie serves the government, that is a different matter. I do not know how literally this phrase should be taken as an explanation of his entire life. It would be too convenient to reduce everything to one lesson from his father, but as a detail, it works almost frighteningly well. Because later, Ames would live according to exactly that logic. Lying is acceptable if it is built into the system. Only at some point, he changed the side that the lie was serving. Ames did not come into the CIA as a rising star. His first job was almost clerical, a records clerk in the Directorate of Operations. In other words, he did not begin with beautiful operations or secret meetings in European capitals, but with the internal paperwork kitchen, with files, folders, cards, routes, old reports, and the bureaucratic traces of other people's operations. And this matters, because sometimes access is formed not through a heroic career, but through routine. A person who sits for years near documents gradually begins to understand the system no worse than the people above him. He may not be a brilliant manager, he may not make an impression, he may irritate his colleagues, but he knows where the information is kept, who is connected to what, which names pass through which departments, and which connections must never be shown to outsiders. His first serious foreign posting, in Ankara, was not a success. In the collected facts, it is described directly as mediocre. After that, he tried to revive his career through the Russian language, and that already brought him closer to the Soviet field. Later, he worked at the U.S. mission to the United Nations in New York. There, he found himself close to Soviet diplomats, defectors, and people who had to be read, checked, interrogated, and evaluated. At one point, he even had an episode that looked like a professional success. In the late 70s, he received praise for his work with Arkady Shevchenko, one of the highest-ranking Soviet defectors. And this is an important detail, because Ames should not be turned into a flat idiot. He was not simply a stupid man who was accidentally given access. He understood the Soviet subject. He knew the language. He had seen how recruitment worked, how interrogation worked, how verification worked, how contact with a source worked. It is just that none of this was still enough to make him a person whom the system should have trusted unconditionally, and yet it trusted him. And the warning signs had been there long before the main catastrophe. In the mid-70s, he forgot a briefcase with classified documents on the New York subway. It sounds almost absurd. Not a failed operation, not the exposure of an agent network, not a complex game against the KGB, just an ordinary forgotten briefcase. The police returned it to the CIA unopened, and the story ended almost happily. But the detail itself says something else. The man who was trusted with secrets was already treating them as if the system would always forgive him, and it did forgive him. Then there were problems with discipline. There were complaints. There were signs of disorder in his work. In one episode, Jean Vertefoy Bruckner reported to management that he had used a safe house for the wrong purpose, for personal meetings. That is not a small thing when we are talking about intelligence. A safe house is not a hotel room, and it is not an employee's personal space. It is an instrument of the service. If a person erases the line between official and personal, in a normal system, a red signal should start flashing. But the signal did not become a fire alarm.
And here, the main disease of this story begins to show itself. Ames was not invisible because he hid perfectly. He was invisible because it was too easy to write him off as a familiar type. Sloppy, problematic, not the strongest, but one of their own. A person like that is irritating, but not frightening. He can be scolded, he can be transferred, he can be considered a failure, but it is much harder to imagine that he is the one capable of becoming the hole through which the entire network will leak out. By the early 80s, he had ended up in the Soviet counterintelligence branch, and that was an entirely different point of access. What passed through there was not just general information about the enemy. There were files on people who were working against the Soviet system from the inside. There were names, connections, assessments, routes, histories of contact, and weak points in operations. There was information that could not be lost under any circumstances. And that is exactly where a man ended up who already had a trail of mediocrity, disorder, and strange warnings behind him. The most frightening thing here is not that the system made a mistake at all. Everyone makes mistakes. The most frightening thing is that the mistake was not instantaneous. It accumulated over years. Every small episode, taken by itself, could be explained. The briefcase, an accident. A bad posting, it happens. Discipline, character. Alcohol, a personal problem. The Safe House, an unpleasant episode, but not the end of a career. Average level, not a crime. Separately, these were stains. Together, they formed the portrait of a man who should not have been given too much silence around him. But he was given it. And when he found himself close to Soviet cases, close to names, close to the internal map of other people's lives, the problem was no longer that he was a weak employee. The problem was that a weak employee had received powerful access. And access is sometimes more dangerous than talent.
But access by itself does not sell anything. Something had to break him. In Ames's case, that crack was money. Not ideology, not love for the Soviet Union, not hatred of America. In the collected facts, he is described directly as a man who was not a communist and was not trying to present himself as a fighter for another system. His weak point was simpler and dirtier. He wanted money. Quickly. A lot of it, and without questions. By the beginning of 1985, his personal life already looked like a financial whirlpool. Divorce, alimony, debts of roughly $47,000 to $50,000, a CIA officer's salary, about $60,000 to $70,000 a year. On paper, that was not poverty, but for a man who was trying to live above his position, it was no longer enough. And then Rosario appeared. Maria del Rosario Casas Dupre was not just a beautiful woman from another life. She herself had once been a paid informant for the CIA in Mexico City. In other words, she did not enter his world as a complete outsider. She understood what intelligence services were, what money was, what cover stories were, what useful connections were. And next to her, Ames, judging by everything, felt his own mediocrity especially sharply. With Rosario, he did not want to be a mid-level employee, not a man with debts, not an eternal internal failure. He wanted to be a man who could pay, buy, arrange, promise. But the real arithmetic was against him. And this is exactly where the story stops looking like an ordinary story about greed. Because greed by itself does not yet make a person a traitor. Something else matters more. Ames found himself at a point where his personal weakness met his professional access. He knew that inside the CIA there was information that was worth money to the Soviet side, and he knew that no one around him saw him as a man capable of selling that information. That combination is what became dangerous. On April 16, 1985, he took a step that looks almost ridiculous if you imagine espionage as a complex game played by masters. No long recruitment, no gradual pressure, no ideological conversation in a dark room. He himself arranged a meeting with the Soviet diplomat Sergei Chuvakin at the Mayflower Hotel. Chuvakin did not come to the meeting. In a normal story, that episode could have ended there. The man would have gotten scared, changed his mind, sobered up, gone home and convinced himself that it had been madness. But Ames, according to the collected facts, drank several vodka martinis for courage and went further. Not metaphorically, literally. He himself went to the Soviet embassy in Washington. This detail matters. He was not caught by the hand. He was not pulled into the game. He did not become the victim of a clever trap. He came on his own. For the first contact, he used the name Andy Robinson. Inside the envelope was information that was meant to show the Soviet side. This was not a fantasist and not a provocateur standing in front of them. Inside was a page from the CIA's internal telephone directory where his name had been highlighted with a marker. It was almost like a business card from a man selling not just rumors, but access to a closed system. Viktor Cherkashin, the KGB officer in Washington, understood the value of the offer quickly. People like this do not come every day. A CIA employee working on the Soviet target brings, by himself, a door into American intelligence. And he asks $50,000 for the first portion of information. The amount was not accidental. It almost exactly matched the size of his financial hole. There is something especially vile in this. The first act of betrayal was not a grand political deal, but an attempt to close a personal gap. As if he did not want to destroy the system, but simply sell off one piece of access, get the money, and breathe out. But that is not how it works. When a person turns secrets into cash once, he is no longer simply solving a problem. He is opening a new way to live. And for Ames, that way turned out to be far too convenient. The Soviet side saw in him not a one-time seller, but a source who could provide much more. Later, he would be given the code name Kolokol, the bell. In other correspondence, he would appear as Ludmila, but in that first moment, the entire future catastrophe still looked almost ordinary. An envelope, an embassy, a diplomat, money. A few weeks later, Chuvakin made contact again, and from that moment, the relationship began turning into a mechanism. Officially, Ames could explain the meetings as attempts to work with a Soviet diplomat. To his superiors, it looked like a professional contact. To him, it was cover. To the KGB, it was a channel for the delivery of information. And here, one of the most unpleasant features of the case appears. None of it was all that complicated. He was not building a perfect technological scheme. He was not creating fantastic devices. He was not hacking systems. He was using what he already had: access, routine, trust,
papers, ordinary meetings, the ability to carry out a document and explain a contact as a service necessity. In that sense, Ames's first sale was dangerous not only because of what he handed over. It proved the main thing to him. This was possible. He could take a fragment of the internal system, carry it outside, and receive money for it. The world did not collapse immediately. No one burst into his office. No one asked the right question in that very minute. The system continued to function as if nothing had happened, and he received confirmation that his weakness could now be paid for with secrets. Later, there would be larger sums. There would be accounts, purchases, luxurious details that could no longer be properly explained. There would be attempts to hide the money, stories about an imaginary friend, strange expenses, and a life that matched his official salary worse and worse. But all of that did not begin with the red car, and not with the house paid for in cash. It began with the moment when a man with access understood that his debts could be paid off with other people's names. And the Soviet side understood it too. The first envelope was only a test. The true price of that access became clear later, when Ames brought not a hint, not a directory, and not trial information, but something after which people began disappearing no longer as abstract lines in reports.
The true price of that access became visible on June 13th, 1985. On that day, Ames brought not a test signal and not proof that he really was a man from the inside. He brought what would later be called in the materials a big dump. The meaning was simple and terrifying. The Soviet side received names and information that opened before it the internal map of the American intelligence network inside the USSR. On paper, this can sound dry. He passed a list, compromised sources, damaged operations. But formulations like that hide the main thing too quickly. In intelligence, a name is not a line in a document. It is a person, his apartment, his family, his usual route, his fear that someone might notice one glance too many, his years of caution, his hope that the people he trusted would be able to protect him. And this is exactly what Ames began to give away. One of the heaviest cases was Dmitry Polyakov, a GRU general whom American intelligence considered one of its most valuable sources. In the collected facts, he appears as a man who had worked for the United States for decades, effectively a quarter of a century. For the CIA, he was not just another informant. He was called the jewel in the crown of American assets in the USSR, and that makes the betrayal especially personal. Ames was not giving up some nameless person from a distant file. He had a long history of working with Soviet cases, with names, with sources, with people whose lives depended on secrecy. Polyakov was arrested in July 1986, the day after his 65th birthday. In March 1988, he was executed by firing squad. But the death of one man was not the whole trace. After Polyakov's arrest, the blow also fell on his family. His wife, according to the collected facts, learned about the execution only a year later from an official notification. The family was stripped of their apartment in Moscow. His son was expelled from a military institute and sent to a construction battalion in Siberia. In other words, the name that went out through Ames did not end with one sentence. It dragged behind it the entire life of people who had not themselves taken part in his secret work. And there were several stories like this. Valery Martinov worked at the Soviet embassy in Washington undercover as a cultural attaché. For the American side, he was a source inside the Soviet system. After the leak, he was lured back to Moscow. Formally, it was under the pretext of accompanying a defector. In reality, it was a trap. After returning, he was arrested and later executed. Sergei Motorin was another man from the same chain. His pseudonym in American materials appeared as Gauze. In the facts, there is an almost unbearable detail. For working for the United States, he received only about $500. Ames, for giving away people like this, received sums of a completely different order. And here, a vile contrast appears. One man risks his life for almost symbolic money, while another sells that name as a product and receives a fortune for it. Motorin, according to the collected data, was also lured into a trap. He ended up in the basements of Lubyanka. Later, he was executed. There was also Adolf Tolkachev, the engineer who was called the billion-dollar spy. He passed to the American side data on Soviet aviation radars and systems that had enormous importance for the military balance. His information, by some estimates, saved the United States billions. After Ames's information, he was arrested and executed. Leonid Polishchuk was seized in Moscow while trying to retrieve a CIA dead drop. Vladimir Piguzov, Vladimir Vasilyev, Gennady Smetanin. In the collected facts, they also appear as people whose fates were destroyed. Some were executed. Some received years in prison. Some disappeared from the operational picture as assets.
But behind that word, again, stood a human being. And the more you look at this list, the more the familiar spy aesthetic breaks apart. In film, betrayal often looks like a game of minds. Who outplayed whom? Who deceived more elegantly? Who set the cleverer trap? Here, everything is rougher. One employee with access passed names. After that, people were pulled out of life. The Soviet side, judging by these facts, also understood the risk of reacting too quickly. There is an episode that sounds almost absurd. The KGB supposedly even apologized to Ames for the too hasty executions of the people he had exposed. Not because it felt sorry for those people, but because such a rapid purge could expose the source inside the CIA himself. This is one of the coldest moments in the entire story, when a service apologizes not for the deaths of people, but for the fact that the deaths of people might ruin the cover.
At some point, the failures themselves became so precise that they could no longer be explained by ordinary bad luck. Sources were not disappearing chaotically. The blow was landing exactly on those whose names could have passed through internal access. And still, the American side kept trying for a long time to search for an explanation somewhere else. Why? Because admitting an internal mole meant admitting not one failure, but an entire series of failures. It meant that someone with clearance had calmly walked past all the rules, that the checks had not worked, that colleagues had seen oddities but had not put them together into a system, that people in Moscow were dying not only because of the strength of the KGB, but also because of blindness in Langley. Ames himself, if the collected materials are to be believed, protected himself from this knowledge with a very convenient logic. He perceived the victims not as people, but as abstract participants in an intellectual game. More than that, he could reason this way. If these people had betrayed their own system, then they had accepted the rules of that game. Therefore, their fate was not his fault, but part of a world in which everyone uses someone. This is a terrifying form of self-justification because it removes the faces, it removes wives, children, apartments, interrogations, basements, the waiting for a sentence. It leaves only a scheme. They are traitors, I am a traitor, everyone is playing. But reality was not a scheme. Reality was that after the big dump, the American-Soviet network began to collapse, and every new failure made the main question sharper. If the disappearances are coming one after another, if the most valuable sources are ending up in the hands of the KGB, if operations are burning too quickly, why is it still so hard to believe that the cause is sitting inside? The answer to that question would not appear immediately. First, there would be versions, technical explanations, convenient hypotheses, attempts to find a complex cause where the simple one was too humiliating, and only later would several people begin to look not at codes, not at equipment, and not at external surveillance, but at something that usually seems too down to earth for a major intelligence catastrophe: at the money. This is exactly what makes the final part of the Ames case so strange. They searched for him as if he were a great spy mystery, but they found him through the thing that ordinary life reveals faster than almost anything else. A man had started living beyond his means. Not through a brilliant cipher, not through secret equipment, not through a random radio transmission, but through bills, lunches, deposits, purchases, and a lifestyle far too expensive for a man living on a government salary. Inside the CIA, by this point, it had already become impossible to simply wave away the failures. Too many sources had disappeared. Too many operations had burned. But admitting that there was an internal mole was still hard. That version destroyed not only the operational picture, it destroyed the system's self-respect. Because if the traitor was inside, then for all those years, they had been looking in the wrong direction. And then a small group of people appears, one that does not look like the final scene of a spy film. No luxurious offices, no dramatic headquarters with huge screens. According to the collected facts, the mole hunting group worked in a cramped room roughly 8 by 8 feet. There were several computers, papers, lists, exhaustion, and the feeling that someone inside their own organization was killing the people they were supposed to protect. At the center of this work were Sandy Grimes and Jean Veftefe. And here, finally, the story changes direction. Until then, the CIA had been trying to understand how the enemy was getting secrets. Now, several people began asking the question differently. Who inside had access to all these cases? Who could have known these sources? Who could have passed exactly this kind of information? And most importantly, whose life, after the first failures, had started looking inexplicably rich? At first, the list was enormous. In the facts, there is a number: 160 people. 160 employees who could, in theory, have had access to the files of the dead or disappeared sources. Just imagining such a list is already unpleasant, because this is not a list of unfamiliar faces. These are colleagues, people from the corridors, meetings, office conversations. One of them could be the person because of whom sources were being arrested and executed in Moscow. Then the list was narrowed down to 20, and then to 1. One of the first everyday details was a phrase from his colleague Diana Worthen: Rick had too much money. Not, he is acting like a traitor. Not, I saw him passing documents. Just, too much money.
Sometimes an investigation begins exactly like that, with a phrase that sounds almost like gossip until it lines up with the dates. Ames bragged about his new Jaguar, a bright red car bought with cash. Then came the house in Arlington for $540,000, also paid for without a mortgage. $90,000 in renovations. Expensive things. Expenses that did not match his official salary. Credit card payments that, in some months, could exceed his income. None of this looked like sophisticated concealment. On the contrary, it looked almost defiant. But a single expensive purchase does not yet prove espionage. The breakthrough came when Sandy Grimes and Dan Payne began comparing dates. Not just looking at the money, but placing bank transactions over service contacts. In the materials, there are three especially important points. May 18, 1985, a deposit of $9,000 after lunch with a Soviet diplomat. July 5th, another $5,000 on the day of a lunch. July 31st, $8,500 in cash. The pattern became too clean to be accidental. Lunch, deposit, contact, money, official meeting, cash in the account. This is where the entire story stops being foggy. Until then, people could argue about versions, about technical leaks, about the Moscow station, about who could have reached the sources and how. But the banking traces were down to earth, stubborn, unpleasant. They did not immediately prove the whole picture, but for the first time, they gave a coordinate system. A person, meetings, money, matching dates. That is exactly why the Ames case shows so clearly the weak point of large organizations. When an explanation looks too simple, people want to set it aside. It seems that a catastrophe of this scale must have a complex cause. But sometimes, a huge system collapses not because of a complex scheme, but because one person receives cash after meetings that everyone considers official. When the financial line became too strong, the FBI joined the case.
And here begins not an analytical hunt anymore, but dense operational work. They watch him, they check his car. Microphones are installed in the Jaguar. When the radio beacon malfunctions, the car is even followed from the air. At night, they take his garbage. This is called trash cover. Ordinary garbage becomes a source of evidence. In the garbage, they find a torn-up note about a meeting in Bogota. It had been torn into 9 pieces. 8 were successfully reconstructed. Sticky notes appear, signals, routes, strange trips, dead-end streets, checks to see whether he is being followed. A man who had lived almost calmly inside the system for years begins turning into an object of surveillance. There is almost mirror-like irony in this. He worked in a world where people are checked, followed, read through small details, where routes and habits are analyzed. And now all of that turns against him. His car, his garbage, his lunches, his money, his household things, everything becomes part of the case. But the FBI could not wait forever. There was a risk that he would leave for Moscow. According to the collected facts, by that point, the Soviet side was already preparing for him the image of a future life. Money, an account, even a photograph of a plot of land for a dacha. For him, it could have looked like a way out. For the investigation, it was the moment after which the case could fall apart. On February 21st, 1994, he was arrested. In the facts, there is an exact time, 9:30 in the morning. He was 52 years old. Around him was the same outer shell of a new life. An expensive car, a house, things, traces of money that he had tried for so long to explain. During the arrest, according to one version, he said that they were making a huge mistake and suggested that they look at the other cars in the parking lot. In another detail, frost was still left on the windshield of the Jaguar. Frost on the car is almost too cinematic a detail. But what makes it good is not its beauty, but its coldness. After all the deaths, after all the lists, after all the years of denial, the ending does not look like an explosion. It looks like an ordinary morning. A man walks out into his familiar life, and that familiar life finally ends. Rosario was arrested too. Later, he made a deal so that she would receive a lighter sentence. Ames himself was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His money, his dacha, his future safe life, all of it disappeared. The materials state that he spent the rest of his life in federal prison and died in 2026 at the age of 84. But if we end there, the moral becomes too convenient. The traitor was caught, the system was cleansed, evil was punished. That is not exactly true. Because the main thing in the Ames case is not that he was eventually arrested. The main thing is how much time it took to see the obvious. How many people had already disappeared? How many operations had been destroyed? How many times strange signals could be written off as character, chance, personal problems, a technical leak, an external game, anything, as long as they did not have to admit that the traitor could be one of their own. He was not a ghost. He was not a perfect master of disguise. He was not a man without traces. His traces were in the money, in the purchases, in the bills, in the dates, in the changed life. It is just that, for far too long,
No one wanted to see those traces as one complete picture. And that is why the Ames case is not only a story about betrayal, it is a story about systemic blindness, about how an organization built on suspicion toward the outside world can become helpless before a familiar face inside, about how access can be more dangerous than talent, about how money sometimes speaks louder than any confession, and about the fact that the most destructive person in the room does not always look like an enemy. Sometimes he looks like an ordinary employee, the very one everyone walks past in the corridor every day.